Hey, we still have attendees coming into our Zoom meeting, so we'll give it just a minute longer before getting started. Okay, well, good morning and welcome to November's meeting of the City Council Sustainability and Climate Action Plan Ad Hoc Committee. I'm Brad Eggleston, Director of Public Works for Palo Alto. We are recording this meeting and we'll be posting it to the city's website, and we'll send out a link following the meeting, and it's also being live streamed on YouTube. And as at our past meetings, you can ask questions or make comments in the Zoom Q&A function during the meeting. And just noting, the staff team will try to answer your questions during the meeting, but we'll also keep track of them and answer them later if there are questions that we're not able to get to. Next slide. So this is the agenda for today's meeting. We'll have a quick review of the October ad hoc meeting that was centered on commercial building electrification. Then we'll get to the principal topic of today's meeting, which is electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging. And we'll also have a review of the former Palo Alto Green program in the context of how potential future similar programs might fit into the SCAP. We will pause after the EV slides for questions and comments from the committee members and an opportunity for public comment, and we'll plan to take a short break at that time. But toward the end of the meeting, after we discuss Palo Alto Green, there will also be another opportunity for public comment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our sustainability manager, Christine Wong.
Thanks, Brad. Hello, everyone. So as Brad mentioned, we had a October SCAP ad hoc meeting focused on non-residential buildings. And we had several questions from the participants covering several themes around technical questions about switching appliances from gas to electric, suggestions for financing options, and just overall questions about the transition to natural gas, how that would happen, how that would affect lower income populations. And we had several helpful suggestions for the participants on things to research more or look into. So ideas for how to better provide assistance for electrification, technical ideas to make it easier to switch appliances, and marketing ideas to raise awareness among the community. So now I'd like to turn the discussion over to Hiromi Kelty, who's going to provide some information on electric vehicles.
Hiromi, you need to unmute yourself and show your video. I was unable to do it. Hiromi, are you there? Can you unmute yourself?
And the goal was to estimate the amount of transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions associated with the city of Palo Alto. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, Hiromi, we can hear you, but we didn't hear the start of your presentation. It might be better if you could start over.
Okay, sorry about that. So this diagram is showing different ways we can reduce transportation emissions. A number of months ago, we embarked on an electric vehicle or EV modeling project. And the goal of that was to estimate the amount of transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions associated with the city of Palo Alto. The modeling focused primarily on personal vehicle travel and the impacts of EV adoption. Our modeling project shows that emissions reductions can come from 3 scenarios.
Hiromi, if you're still speaking, we're not hearing you.
Yeah, it looks like she
Yeah.
froze.
Yeah, let's give her a moment. Hiromi, you may want to turn off your video if you have a bandwidth issue.
Well, while we're waiting for Hiromi, I can finish this slide at least until she comes back online. So as Hiromi was saying, emissions can be reduced by 3 different scenarios. You can reduce vehicle miles traveled by encouraging more telework, building more housing near transit, encouraging programs to get people out of cars or to reduce solo vehicle trips. The second way is to electrify vehicle travel. If you need to drive, can you do it in an electric car? And the third, which would be improving what's called internal combustion engine fuel efficiency. So improving the miles per gallon reduces the greenhouse gases emitted per mile driven. And obviously we have very little control over number 3. So today, hopefully when Hiromi gets back on, she will focus on number 2, which is electrifying vehicle travel and the impacts it can have on reducing emissions. And next month, Sylvia Starlack from the Office of Transportation will talk about reducing vehicle miles traveled, as you can see in the green section of number 1.
Hello?
Yeah, and
Thank
Hiromi
you.
looks like she's back. We can hear you now.
Okay. I am so sorry about that.
Happens all the time.
I'm
No
not
worries.
sure what happened there. Thank you, Christine. I just want to say that today I'll be focusing on number 2. Some acronyms I'll be using a lot is ICE for internal combustion engine, VMT for vehicle miles traveled. And next month, our colleague Sylvia Starlack will be talking about number 1, reducing VMT. And today I'll be focusing on number 2. Next slide. So many of you have probably seen this pie chart before. The red section represents the emissions coming from transportation in Palo Alto. And as you can see, transportation accounts for roughly 2/3 of our greenhouse gases. To reach 80% emissions reduction by 2030, drastic changes need to be made in the transportation sector along all possible avenues. That would mean travel by personal vehicles must be significantly reduced, and remaining vehicle travel must be electrified to the greatest extent possible. With community buy-in and societal trends such as telework, Palo Alto can reduce transportation emissions, but to do so will require the following. By 2030, 85% of new vehicle sales are EVs, and 44% of vehicles registered in Palo Alto need to be electric. Vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, needs to be reduced not just by residents, but also by commuters and visitors. And across the board, VMT fulfilled by EVs needs to increase. Charging ports will need to be installed across the city to serve all of these EVs. And for those that need to drive a gas car, we need to hope that efficiency of ICE vehicles will increase. I'll be addressing many of these points in more detail throughout the presentation, but I want to set the stage for what we need to be prepared for. Achieving these outcomes is no easy task and will require clear strategy, well-managed implementation, significant resources, and extraordinary community awareness and participation. However, we already know that electric vehicles are cheaper to drive than gas vehicles and will result in sizable savings in total cost of ownership for the community. As we look at the overall cost of emissions reductions, which will be incurred while striving to reach our 80 by 30 goal, the transition to EVs contributes to savings. Overall, changes in the transportation sector are some of the most impactful as we strive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next month, my colleagues will focus on key actions in mobility to help reach SCAP goals. But for today, I'll focus on transportation electrification. Next slide, please. So this is a pie chart showing carbon emissions in 2020 from road transportation. One of the things we were surprised to learn is that a third of our emissions are from residents, a third from visitors, and a third from commuters. And I'd like to define visitors, who are the non-residents and non-commuters, and this would include delivery trucks. The biggest challenge is influencing the behavior of visitors who neither work nor reside in Palo Alto. There are very few policy levers that can be applied to this group, and to a large extent, improvements in this category will be dependent on regional and statewide efforts to reduce VMT. The chart on the right is showing the emissions, current emissions from each customer segment and where we need to get to by 2030. Next slide. So when you tally it up to reach 80 by 30, our target is to get from 290,000 metric tons to 124 metric tons per year by 2030, which is about a 60% reduction. Reductions will need to come from higher EV penetration, higher fuel efficiency of ICE vehicles, and higher utilization of alternative modes of transportation. Next slide. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about the total cost of ownership of EVs. In 2020, a comprehensive report was published by Consumer Reports showing that EVs are significantly cheaper to own and operate than comparable internal combustion engine or ICE vehicles. Initial purchase prices of EVs can be higher than a gas equivalent vehicle, but the cumulative fuel, repair, and maintenance savings of an EV easily closes this gap, resulting in overall savings over the lifetime of the vehicle. This chart shows some of the most popular EVs and plug-in hybrids and the estimated lifetime savings compared to same in-class vehicles. This report also highlights used EVs as an affordable pathway. Overall, in the US, used cars account for most car purchases, 70% of them in 2019. Right now, due to supply chain issues worldwide, the used car market is also very tight. But going forward, we'll always be looking for opportunities to promote and encourage consumers to seek out used EV opportunities. Next slide. Based on analysis by AECOM, which is the consultant the city hired to do emissions analysis in Palo Alto, in our city, a 2020 EV will yield an average of about $600 in savings per year. I want to point out that this comparison is based on the typical car that travels about 13,000 miles a year. As EV prices decrease and gasoline prices increase, this margin will get bigger. Savings can be even higher if you incorporate additional incentives. And I want to point out that $600 is a very conservative number and was calculated when gas was $3.26 a gallon. Today, with gas prices closer to $5 a gallon, the average savings per year more than doubles to about $1,300. Next slide. Ideally, as a community, we'll collectively need to reduce the amount of driving we do. However, if you need to drive, EVs make so much sense. EVs will play an important role in emissions reductions. They are cheaper to drive and have less maintenance, which means lower costs, and charging in Palo Alto especially makes sense since our electricity prices are relatively low and carbon neutral. Next slide. Now, I've talked a lot about emissions, and I'd like to put into context what we're trying to do in Palo Alto relative to what's being done in the rest of the state and the country. These numbers up top are hot off the press. California is getting closer and closer to 1 million EV sales. We definitely have the highest adoption rates of EVs anywhere in the country, which is 2.5%. The state goal is to have 5 million ZEVs or zero emission vehicles on the road by 2030 and 100% of new vehicles to be ZEV by 2035. Next slide. So where's Palo Alto compared to that? We are at 10% EV ownership. So we're doing great. I think we're the only city in the country with a double-digit adoption rate. However, there's a huge gap in EV ownership between multifamily and single-family residents. 12% of single-family residential vehicles are EVs today, and only 4.5% in the multifamily sector. And we have to remember that 42% of our Palo Alto households live in multifamily residences. Next slide. So where's Palo Alto relative to the state? This is a nice graph that shows 2.5% ownership rates for the state of California, with the goal of 5 million ZEVs by 2030, which would be a 16% ownership percentage. In Palo Alto, in 2020, we're already at 10%, but if our goal is to get to 80 by 30, at 2030, EV ownership rates needs to reach 44%. Next slide. So here's another way to look at where we need to go. We currently have about 5,000 EVs registered in Palo Alto, and that needs to get to 28,000 by 2030. EV ownership rates in Palo Alto are already 4 times that of the state, but we still have a long, long way to go to reach 80 by 30. Next slide. So we conducted a survey in 2018, and we learned a lot of great things. The first being the majority of early EV adopters were driving an EV because it was better for the environment. We also learned that the majority of people, 73%, were charging at home. And the top data point I recently updated, back in 2018, that was 1 in 7 households. But today, 1 in 6 households already has an EV. Next slide. The thing that we also learned that the majority of customers were open to the idea of having their next vehicle be an EV, which was very encouraging. But one of their biggest concerns was possibly not having access to EV charging. Next slide. Aside from the survey, we also engaged the community of early EV adopters to determine the best use of funds available for EV programs. And instead of giving rebates to early EV adopters who probably would have purchased an EV with or without a $500 check, we collectively decided that funds should go to schools, nonprofits, and multifamily properties, which are slower to move with limited access to funds for EV charging installations. In many cases, large commercial properties have proactively been installing EV charging infrastructure, so we haven't put priority on this customer segment. As a result, based on what we heard from customers, we have focused our efforts on number 1, raising awareness, number 2, EV incentives in collaboration with the state, and number 3, facilitating the installation of EV charging infrastructure at multifamily and nonprofit properties, which also includes technical assistance. Next slide. To support all of these EVs, we will need a lot of infrastructure. The port counts on this table only represent those which are public and shared and do not include EV chargers installed at single-family homes. As you can see, we'll need a 10-fold increase from where we are today. Next slide. Here's a list of our current programs. To reach our targets, as you saw earlier, there's a need for a lot of infrastructure. These are a list of EV programs we've been able to launch so far with existing resources. The batteries represent programs which facilitate the installation of EV charging infrastructure. And the big battery represents the key target customer segment for that program. For example, many of the infrastructure-related programs are targeting residents who are renters or multifamily residents. But as you can see from the little batteries, these charging ports could residually also benefit commuters and visitors. The first group of programs are specifically designed to serve multifamily and nonprofits, and this includes schools. We have an EV charging rebate program, which we launched in 2017, and we offer $8,000 support. We launched a transformer upgrade program to help defray the costs of utility distribution system upgrades triggered by EV applications. And for this, we offer up to $100,000 for multifamily and nonprofits, and up to $10,000 for single-family homes. EV TAP, or EV Technical Assistance Program, is a program we are particularly proud of. Today, technical assistance is an industry buzzword used around building electrification and installing EV charging infrastructure. However, as far as I know, we were the first to launch a program like this in the fall of 2019. Since then, our neighboring CCAs, the community choice aggregators, such as Silicon Valley Clean Energy, Peninsula Clean Energy, and East Bay Clean Energy, have also followed suit and launched an EV charging TAP, or Technical Assistance Program, with the same vendor we're contracted with, and that would be ClearResult. With this program, we're promoting EV charging in multifamily properties and nonprofits by providing rebates and technical assistance. And it involves a series of site visits, technical evaluations, engineering reviews, which all culminate in the landlord receiving contractor bids, and then assistance submitting a building permit and collecting rebates. EV TAP services are free of charge to eligible customers. We're also piloting a curbside EV charging program. And we've installed 120 city-owned charging ports available to the public where residents can charge their EVs overnight. We've also partnered with Tesla to install 19 superchargers at Bryan Street Garage, and I understand permits have been submitted and are under review. Raising awareness is a top priority, and hosting workshops, events, and online tools is very important, and the community seems to be hungry for the information. Most recently, we sponsored an EV charging workshop in September during National Drive Electric Week with over 70 attendees. We're exploring various ways to improve our online EV tools. We're in contract negotiations to offer EV education classes, which will lead to group buy discount opportunities. We're also looking to offer financial incentives clinics and one-on-one case management for our income qualified customers. Once we're ready for in-person events, we hope to launch a series of in the neighborhood EV block party type events, building upon the Cool Blocks model. With Clean Fuel Rewards, we're providing funding to the state-run program to provide point-of-sale EV incentives at local dealerships. And finally, with Cali VIP, we partnered with other regional energy providers to provide a workplace and public charging incentive program for San Mateo and Santa Clara County. On top of these programs, annually, we analyze confidential DMV EV registration data in Palo Alto to assess electric distribution system expansion needs. Our engineering team is evaluating ways of accommodating the installation of EV chargers with load control systems. And lastly, this year and next year, we're piloting a 20 cents per kilowatt hour electric rate for DC fast chargers. Next slide. So you're probably wondering, how are we paying for all of this? So far, unlike other utilities, we have not needed to use any ratepayer funds for our EV programs, but there's a high likelihood that we'll eventually deplete our current resources. The City of Palo Alto Utilities participates in the California Air Resource Board, or CARB's Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program, and we call that LCFS. We get credits whenever someone in Palo Alto switches to an EV and from the sale of electricity to fuel those EVs. And we also get credits from electricity dispensed through city-owned chargers. To date, we have about $8 million to spend on EV programs and estimate LCFS will continue to generate $1.5 to $2.5 million a year in credits. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, Cali VIP is a matching grant program in which we collaborated with a number of partners, and we were awarded $1 million to install chargers for commuters and visitors. Fortunately, we have plenty of funds for now. However, we are short-staffed, and we're doing the best that we can by amplifying what we can offer by hiring third-party vendors to administer or help us administer programs. Next slide. So here are some results of our efforts. I'd like to think that we're having an impact right now. With our EV TAP program, the goal is to install up to 360 ports at 10% of our 800 multifamily properties by 2024. 360 ports may not seem like a lot, but one of the goals of this program is to help properties be prepared for the future. Many properties are only ready for a few ports right now and not ready to electrify their buildings quite yet. But our program is requiring the installation of make-ready infrastructure, as the strategy is to make adding additional ports a lot easier in the future. And also making sure that there's an opportunity to be able to electrify their buildings. When we have 48 sites actively working their way through this program, and the pandemic definitely slowed things down. But to date, 4 sites have submitted permits, and we expect more in the coming months. We're expanding our sales and marketing efforts for our multifamily EV rebate charging program to generate more participation. We're also piloting sales management techniques that could be used with other electrification programs. For our EV charger rebate program, since the launch of the program, we've facilitated the installation of 62 new EV charging ports at 12 sites. And this includes 5 multifamily and 7 nonprofits, including 3 schools. The average cost of each port so far has been about $10,000, and the projects have ranged about 8 months to complete. As EV TAP projects move forward, expenditures for EV charger rebates and as well as for transformer upgrade expenditures will increase. The transformer upgrade program. I want to point out that, as many of you know, the properties in Palo Alto tend to be older. And through EV TAP, we're learning that about half of all projects will need bigger transformers. And this will require more resources and experienced staff. And the California Clean Fuel Rewards Program. This is yet another example of our very engaged customers going above and beyond. Since the launch of this point of purchase program in November 2020, Palo Alto residents have earned 633 rebates. To put this into perspective, in PG&E, they've had about 1% of their households purchasing an EV and participating in this program. In Palo Alto, 2.5% of households have purchased an EV taking advantage of this rebate. And then lastly, Cali VIP, the program is fully subscribed and will result in 100 new level 2 charging ports and 12 to 14 DC fast chargers. Next slide, please. With limited resources, amplifying what we can offer by working with third-party vendors has been crucial. But another important strategy is state, regional, and local collaboration. I've mentioned Cali VIP, but another source of grant funding has been the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, or BACMed, for the installation of city-owned public EV chargers. Multiple neighboring CCAs are now working with ClearResult, which has been giving birth to collaborative opportunities with properties that have multiple sites throughout the peninsula. Some examples are low-income multifamily housing authorities and nonprofits, such as the YMCA. Cal VIP was one example, but we check in with the CCAs regularly, and we're looking to collaborate with them on potential programs, such as tools for vetted contractor lists and contractor training. Another important pathway is partnering with large employers. A great example of this is SAP. Our utilities key account representatives have nurtured relationships with our largest customers for years. And the EV team has nurtured relationships with a number of active EV charger installers, which has led to very large installations, such as this project at SAP, which took advantage of employees working from home last year, and they installed 135 new charging ports. This photo shows just kind of a drawing of where those first 21 chargers are. We were also invited to participate in Stanford Healthcare's sustainability visioning process, which has led to actively working with 4 of their properties to install EV chargers. And hopefully that's just the beginning. This collaboration models a partnership process we would like to expand to other major employers in Palo Alto. And now I'd like to turn it over to Denitra Ballman, the city's fleet manager.
Thank you, Hiromi. Good morning, everyone. For this first slide, I'll be presenting on behalf of Refuse and providing a brief overview of fleet electrification efforts related to the refuse collection fleet. The photos here show the different types of the 4 current all-electric trucks in the fleet. And it was in 2016 that Palo Alto first purchased the fully automated side loader for residential collection in the US through its refuse collection contract with Green Waste of Palo Alto. This specific vehicle, which is shown on the top left portion of the screen, saves approximately 6,000 gallons of diesel per year and reduces emissions by about 78 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. The city is planning to systematically electrify the refuse collection fleet with plans to order 3 additional EVs in the next few years. Moving on to the next slide, I'd like to share a little bit about city fleet electrification. In late May, Fleet engaged an outside consultant to conduct an EV and associated charging infrastructure study. For the electric vehicle analysis portion of the study, we have a total of 352 vehicles being assessed, which are composed of 240 light-duty vehicles, 66 medium-duty vehicles, and 46 heavy-duty vehicles. The study is still in draft and under review, but I'm happy to share a few initial positive findings. I do want all to keep in mind that what I'm sharing assumes perfect conditions, no constraints. Examples of what I mean by this are assumptions that EVs are suitable for every application, budget is sufficient, and infrastructure is in place. A preliminary report indicates that approximately 50% of Palo Alto's fleet can be replaced with equivalent vehicles that are commercially available and likely to be cost effective. Including potentially electrifiable vehicles, Palo Alto can electrify 53% of its light duty vehicles by 2030 and 100% by 2040. Data suggests that the city can achieve carbon emissions reductions of 31% from 2019 levels from its fleet by 2030, even if electrification is limited to vehicles that have an equivalent and cost-effective EV currently available. So that's pretty awesome. It means that auto manufacturers are making considerable effort to have light-duty EV options in the marketplace. And then one last assessment I feel significant confirmed that electric vehicle range is not a barrier to vehicle electrification for the city. For 95% of vehicles assessed, it was determined that the recommended EV option could satisfy 100% of our existing vehicles' historical driving behavior. Now, if we could go on to the next slide, I'm going to touch on just a few key challenges that fleet is facing in the road to vehicle electrification. You may have noticed that I did not mention our medium and heavy duty vehicles, and that's because none of these vehicles are electrifiable with current electric vehicles that do not have cost effectiveness or operational concerns. To further compound this dilemma, California Air Resources Board is drafting the Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation, which as it reads now would mandate a percentage of all medium and heavy duty truck replacements beginning in the year 2024 be replaced with EVs each year until 2027, when 100% EV replacement would be required. This regulation will affect our ability to replace vehicles in a timely manner due to budget constraints, and will affect our ability to choose the best fit EV replacements considering total cost of ownership and market availability. And then we have the lack of dedicated EV charging infrastructure. The good news is that part of the electrification study we are conducting will provide a building and facilities assessment for EV charging infrastructure needs. This assessment should help staff create an implementation plan going forward. Also, as I understand it, our engineering group is going to be conducting its own assessment on all city-wide buildings and facilities to understand the needs to convert gas systems to electric. And a final copy of Fleet's EV charging infrastructure study will be shared with engineering's consultants so that they can incorporate these recommendations in their analysis. Outside of vehicle electrification, I wanted to take a moment to highlight that the city is switching to renewable diesel for all vehicles and equipment. And by doing so, it is estimated that we could realize up to a 75% reduction in carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. As the calculations show below, and based on the city's average annual diesel consumption, which is about 65,000 gallons per year, the city's fleet produces approximately 739 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. By switching to renewable diesel, we stand to potentially reduce this number to 185 metric tons per year, reducing overall by 555 metric tons. As an added bonus, renewable diesel is now practically cost neutral by comparison, and we also stand to benefit from reduced maintenance costs as renewable diesel burns much cleaner. So to wrap up, it's important that to understand that there are many factors that will come into play as fleet works to navigate towards vehicle electrification. Planning out and setting future vehicle replacement schedules will be a challenge and will be subject to change as things develop. And although in the big picture, Palo Alto's fleet stands to make a very small impact on overall carbon emissions reductions, it's important that we also strive to do our part for our community. So thank you for having me. And now I'll hand it back to Hiromi.
Thank you, Denitra. So this is a list of programs that we're planning for the next year. I'd like to highlight just a few. First of all, we're looking into ways we may be able to use LCFS funds to incentivize the on-demand transit program that the Office of Transportation is currently working on, and integrating EVs into that fleet. We're also in the process of enhancing the existing EV technical assistance program to include direct install services at income qualified multifamily properties. And lastly, we're trying to integrate the installation of level 1 charging ports for e-bikes throughout our EV TAP program. Next slide. So I've talked a lot about EVs, but e-bikes are definitely an important part of the conversation, especially as it relates to getting people out of their cars, reducing congestion, and as a cost-effective strategy to reduce emissions. We have not focused much attention on charging infrastructure for e-scooters or e-skateboards, as these can easily be carried indoors and charged at any 110-volt electrical outlet. However, that is not always the case for e-bikes. And in our SCAP implementation plan under city fleet electrification, we've defined the key action to consider replacement vehicles only when an e-bike isn't a viable option. And some examples of agencies that are piloting these like e-bikes would be the Portland Bureau of Transportation and the City of Madison. These are the pictures in the middle. They are trying out these e-cargo utility bikes, which are tricycles that can carry 880 pounds of capacity. Apparently the staff so far are really enjoying using them, and the weather there in both locations is not as nice as Palo Alto, but they're enjoying it. And the most important thing is the community is loving these e-bikes. And the biggest feedback is employees are more approachable to the community. On the far right, this is an e-bike that was brought to my attention just last week. And they're very interesting. They have a range of 15 miles at 25 miles an hour. And at $5,500, they're much more expensive than a bicycle or an e-cargo bike, but they could potentially replace a car. Legally, they're bicycles, so you don't have to pay for parking, and you're protected from the weather, and there's enough space for a second person. There are solar panels on the roof, which don't have enough power to drive the tricycle, but the panels can charge up the battery in about 8 hours. Next slide. And now I want to talk a little bit about some of our challenges. This is a slide that was shared at a PG&E presentation about EVs. And the slide was actually made by the Rocky Mountain Institute. And I love the title, Solidarity in Struggles. You know, everyone sees kind of the finished product, the EV chargers, which are charged up, and it seems like a pretty easy project to do. However, I want to point out that every commercial EV charging installation is an iceberg. There are always so many costs, hidden costs, the coordination between all of the various stakeholders, the permitting process, the ADA requirements. Each project does feel like an iceberg. Next slide. This photo on the left is something that my colleague Lisa Benatar shared with you last month, but it was taken at a local multifamily apartment, actually on Forest Avenue. And you could see the electrical meters and the gas meters are very close together. According to engineering and operations, about half of the multifamily properties in Palo Alto have this situation going on, which was fine pre-code. But today, if you touch the electrical, which means if you put in an EV charger, you're touching the electrical, these meters need to be relocated so that they are safer. In this case, this property owner received a bill for the relocation of the gas meters to be $6,500. Another challenge or something that I've been seeing a lot in the neighborhood are very creative customers coming up with their own curbside charging solutions, which can potentially be very dangerous. And what we hope to see is something a lot safer, like the photo on the right, which was taken at our EV enthusiast resident Sven Thiesen's home, where he installed a curbside EV charger, which was permitted and done safely. Next slide. So this is a picture of a construction project which was completed during the lockdown at Fletcher Middle School and on Arrestadero Road. The installation includes 18 level 2 EV chargers and 1 level 3 fast charger. It all looks nice and tidy here, but I just wanted to show you some pictures of what actually happens behind the scenes to get this project in place. Because we're talking about electrical work and bringing conduit, there's a lot of digging, which always adds a lot of cost, but there's a lot that goes on to each of these projects at commercial sites. Next slide, please. So here's a list of proposed key actions for EVs. The SCAP team has put together a work plan document, which some of you may have already seen. This slide is a snapshot of the initiatives planned for the EV section of the SCAP. All of our current and future programs through 2024 will fall into one of these categories. Next slide. So programs alone will not get us to where we want to be. The challenges of achieving ambitious climate goals calls for a comprehensive slate of well-designed and well-executed policies. Many of these policies can be adjusted based on how conservative or aggressive the goals are set. Community acceptance will be crucial for potential new policies and programs to be effective. The potential policy options listed here can be considered by the community if it wants to accelerate EV adoption. The options targets 3 categories: Palo Alto residents, commuters, and visitors. For residents, the primary goal would be to maximize EV ownership and usage. This would mean taking a look at carbon pricing, which is one of the few policy levers available for disincentivizing ICE usage. 2 particular areas of focus are lower income residents and the expansion of charging infrastructure at multifamily properties. This could look like an annual utility bill credit to accounts that can show that an EV is registered at the residence, or an ICE usage fee to disincentivize the usage of ICE vehicles, or a mandate to install EV chargers at multifamily properties, or an incentive to help lower income customers install EV chargers. For commuters, the primary goal would be to encourage the use of alternative transportation to reduce vehicle miles traveled, while maximizing EVs for the remaining vehicle traffic. We want to disincentivize employees from commuting in single occupancy gas vehicles and ensure that EV charging is available at commercial buildings. And for visitors, as I mentioned earlier, the biggest challenge is influencing the behavior of this group as they don't live or work in Palo Alto. We'll need to collaborate with regional and statewide efforts to reduce VMT, but one thing we can do is to make it more convenient to visit and park in Palo Alto with an EV and more inconvenient with an ICE vehicle. One approach could be to charge a parking fee for ICE vehicles and offer free parking for EVs. Staff acknowledges the administrative complexity of applying any of these policies, especially carbon pricing, and legal analysis will be required to determine feasibility. Some other policies would be consumer education. We'll need more resources, but the success of any policies hinges on a broad awareness and understanding of the benefits of EVs and available incentives. And targeted efforts would be particularly impactful for multifamily and lower income residents who have more obstacles to EV adoption. Light EVs and e-bikes. Greater utilization of light EVs, which includes e-scooters, e-skateboards, and e-bikes, reduces vehicle-based traffic and an effective means of reducing transportation emissions. We need more time and resources, but the hope is to establish incentives, especially for e-bikes. In the meantime, we'll bring up e-bikes whenever possible in all of our existing programs. Specialized fleets, Palo Alto municipal vehicles, commuter buses, and delivery vans are examples of some small niche segments that can be specifically targeted for electrification. While they make up a negligible share of the total VMT, converting these fleets can serve as a public signal, like Denitra said, especially with the city-owned fleet. In some cases, an EV replacement is not yet available, but the landscape is changing rapidly, and in the near future, the city may be in a position to assess and establish clear targets. Next slide. So I'd like to make a call to action for all of us to collaborate. Staff needs to continue to engage the community, And we ask the community to engage their networks, including friends, family, neighbors, and colleagues, to achieve a seismic shift in how each of us thinks about transportation and how we get from point A to point B. Secondly, we ask the community to let the city know what we can do to support the community in its transportation electrification journey. And third, the programs we're running right now on their own are not going to achieve 80 by 30. We need to evaluate additional policy options, such as mandates or other mechanisms to accelerate the adoption of EVs, because without mandates, it's highly unlikely that we'll be able to reach our 80 by 30 goals. Next slide. And this is my last slide. Palo Alto's goal for 80% emissions reduction by 2030 is bold and ambitious. However, without drastic changes in transportation, 80 by 30 is a non-starter. This will require monumental efforts in policy and community engagement. The EV modeling effort revealed the actions and results necessary to achieve 80 by 30. The policies I outlined earlier are a best attempt to explore all possible avenues. However, there is no guarantee that even if these policies are put in place, we'll achieve our goals. In the meantime, we'll continue to monitor progress and implement programs as resources allow. If the community wants to get to 80 by 30, by 2030, 85% of new vehicle sales in Palo Alto will need to be EVs. And in addition to reduction in overall VMT, we'll need to see a big leap in remaining VMT becoming electric. EV ownership will be incentivized and ICE usage disincentivized. Widespread charging infrastructure would be in place to support mass EV adoption with equitable access for renters, multifamily, and low-income residents. Major employers and public parking would have policies in place to accelerate EV usage. And best of all, the community will be saving tens of millions of dollars each year from vehicle cost of ownership, while setting an example to the world on the path to a sustainable future. Thank you. Next slide. And now we're going to pause the presentation to take questions and comments from Vice Mayor Burt and Council Member Cormack.
Shall I, Pat?
Go right ahead.
Okay. So I think the Vice Mayor and I discussed doing comments now and then going to the public, and then we might come back with some more questions. Is that what we agreed on?
Yes, it is.
Or more questions now and then comments at the end, but
Sorry, yeah, I
Okay.
inverted that. Questions now and then the public, and then we'll come back to us for some comments. Super helpful. Thank you, Ms. Kelty, and everyone else who presented for providing this level of data and getting more concrete. You mentioned that we're going to need to have 33,000 charging ports in total. So that was public and private. How many do we have now?
I think the public and shared needs to be more like 15,000.
You had a number early that
You
said we
have
needed
33,000?
early on. You had one that was 33,000.
You did.
Don't have to answer now, but that would be helpful to understand how many we have now.
No, I think some of my colleagues in the back that were involved with the modeling might be
Okay.
able to respond to that.
Another question is what, sorry, yes.
I can
Mr.
answer that.
Swaminathan?
So the 33,000 is single family, multifamily, and shared. But so that includes single family homes. But what Hiromi's slide showed was only shared and public, which is a subset of it.
Right. So my question is, how many of the 33,000 that we need to have do we have now?
Okay. Let's see. We estimate about 15, about 4,200.
4,200. Very helpful. Thank you. My next question has to do with the rate of charging. What assumptions are we making about the ports that will be installed and the rate at which they will charge? And, just to be super clear, I think as the infrastructure and technologies are evolving, it's possible we'll get to a point where people will be able to charge more quickly and everyone might not need to be charging overnight, for example. So any thoughts on the rate of charging that you assumed for these ports?
I think the assumption that we've made is, at least for multifamily, the EV chargers are going, the level 2 chargers are going in shared parking spaces, and that those would be used by at least 2 drivers per day. And you're right. I mean, the charging rate may increase, but right now we're assuming 2 people using those chargers every day.
Okay, so we're making our projections based on our current technology.
Yes.
Okay. Next question. And I think some of it was addressed in a Q&A, but they go by quickly. And so in terms of the progress that we need to make on replacing cars over time, are we anticipating that progress would be linear, meaning that every year a certain number of people will replace their vehicles and those will become electric? Or, do we think there's going to be a surge, to use your words, Ms. Kelty, a seismic shift? That if we hit at some point in the next 9 years, sufficient charging pervasively available, do we anticipate that the rate at which EVs are adopted would accelerate? Thoughts on that?
I have a backup slide for that, and I'm asking the group to put it up.
Okay.
It would be slide number 55. I think I don't know if the question was answered at a certain point in the Q&A. I'm not sure. It looks like it may have been, but I think the point of this is that fleet turnover is a lot slower than we would think. This is a snapshot of 2020. And I think the point of this slide is that over a quarter of Palo Alto's vehicles are over 15 years old. And vehicles do not uniformly get replaced past a certain age. You could also see that blip at the very end, which shows, there are people, enthusiasts, that really enjoy their old vintage vehicles. And so I think the conclusion is, as a result, fleet turnover is slow, but even with 100% new EV sales starting right now, we would only reach 60 to 70% EV ownership by 2030.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you so much on that. My next question is about the low carbon fuel standard funds. You mentioned the $8 million. Is that what is available in the fund now, or is that what is accumulated over time? It's what's available now.
It's a cumulative number.
Oh, it is cumulative.
It is cumulative.
And it's also what is available now?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. My next question might be for, I'm sorry, the presenter who was after you. I didn't write down her name.
Anitra?
Yes. I don't know what renewable diesel is. Could someone please tell me what renewable diesel is?
Hi, Denitra here. Yeah, so renewable diesel has been around for several years now. And like I mentioned earlier, it's a much cleaner burning fuel. Currently, fleet is, like I said, switching. We, I think, are expecting our first delivery. There are several other organizations that have been piloting this as early as back to 2015, I believe it was, that City of Oakland started switching their entire fleet, including their fire engines, over to renewable diesel. And they have experienced, as I mentioned, great results with it. As I mentioned, the reduced maintenance costs. Some of the diesel particulate filters in these heavy duty trucks are no longer having to be maintained as frequently and serviced as often as they are using conventional diesel. So with that and all the other information that we've gathered from other agencies such as City of San Jose, Pleasanton, East Bay Mud, just to name a few of the local organizations that have been using renewable diesel, we are deciding to also switch and hopefully reap the benefits as well.
Okay,
And if
I
I could add
appreciate all the
briefly-
benefits, but I still don't understand, like, how is it created? And, yeah.
Yes, can I add
Please.
briefly? This is Brad, and I'm not an expert in the area, but the main difference is renewable diesel is not a fossil fuel. It's made from biogenic feedstocks, like for instance, vegetable oil or other types of plant products. And you may have heard of biodiesel in the past,
Yes.
which was often made from used vegetable oils, even collected from restaurants.
Yeah.
It's a similar process, but different. And the net result is that you end up with a diesel product that's basically equivalent to fossil fuel diesel in most ways, and can be blended and doesn't require any special modifications of diesel engines or any need to only have a certain amount of the renewable diesel as a blend with fossil fuel diesel.
Okay, super
That's exactly
helpful.
correct. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Those are the questions I have, and then look forward to hearing from my colleague and the public, and then I'm sure we'll have an opportunity for comments.
Great. Well, thanks very much for the presentation and for Councilmember Cormack's questions. It really is a lot of really valuable information that we've been provided. So I have a number of questions. One really goes to the that conclusion slide that I was really appreciative that Ms. Kelty had really focused on. As strong as our programs are, we have this challenge of what's the gap between what we're doing as one of the leading cities on similar types of programs compared to what we would need to do to actually achieve our 80-30 goal. And so one of the things I wanted to focus on that element is with the various funding programs we have now for EV charging, how does that align with our projected need for numbers of EV chargers and where they would be by 2030? How much of a funding gap is there? So that's the first question.
I can try to answer that question. So that I think you're asking a funding question, but there's also a resource in terms of expertise and manpower to be able to support upgrades and permitting. So, but I'll stick to the funding only portion.
Actually, I'd welcome the other half is it was alluded to a staffing need, and I couple those together. So please feel free to.
I don't have an answer to the second part, unfortunately, but maybe some others would. But for the first part, in terms of funding, we are focusing our attention on EV charging at the multifamily properties and non-for-profits. For those two segments, and not on commercial or single family. That's our current focus. For those focused areas, we'll have sufficient funding at current rebate levels for about 2024 timeline. The charger needs of about 2,000 chargers by 2024 at those locations. We have sufficient funding, but beyond that, we wouldn't have sufficient funding from the low carbon fuel standard programs to support that.
So that
So building on that, I think one of the things, Jonathan Abendschein, Assistant Director of Utilities Resource Management. So one of the things that we talked about in the impact analysis and in other presentations was the total community investment that was needed for charging, which was in the, I would have to go back and get the exact number, but it was in the $300 to $400 million range, I believe. I guess don't quote me on that one. I should get back to you with a real number, but it was very large. And I think one of the big questions in the impact analysis, and that will be a question going forward, is who is funding that investment right now. For example, we've been providing incentives for multifamily charging infrastructure, but single family charging infrastructure has happened largely through individual customer investment, and the same with workplace charging. So that is when we start talking more broadly about funding and staffing, that's going to have to be and especially, we've talked a little bit about the early phase of the SCAP and the later phase of the SCAP, the early phase being where we're pushing voluntary programs and gaining momentum, and the later phase where we really are scaling up to almost 10x volume of activity in order to achieve the goals. Figuring out where the funding will come from for that later phase is a topic. It's going to be a topic that's going to take some examination over the next year. I actually don't expect we're going to have a clear answer to that within the next 2 to 3 months.
Okay, thank you. And so the 2,000 multifamily chargers by 2024 is a significant amount of progress. What's the 2030 number that we would need for multifamily?
$4,000.
I'm sorry, how many?
4,000.
4,000. Okay. Well, that's a significant dent. And one of the things that maybe we can, well, it'll be as a follow-up, but one of the real key questions we have is, are charging stations really part of our capital infrastructure? We sell electricity. We actually have significant transfers to the general fund and through a utility users tax and utility transfers. So it's basically as much as we have exceptionally low residential rates in particular compared to PG&E and most surrounding communities. What I think about 40% below on residential rates. We still have that basically that we make profit off our electricity sales, and we're driving electrification, which moves even more in that direction. So I'm going to be very interested in having that discussion on to what extent do we view charging as essentially their meters for us to sell electricity, and whether that can be funded to the degree that our rates can absorb it and the need exists to achieve the outcome that we're looking for. A number of the projections were based upon current costs and advancements of the technology. And I think it's very important that we have kind of two sets. One, the baseline that's based on current technology and current costs, and the other that is based upon maybe a range on the going forward projections. We certainly know that we've seen a rapid decline in the costs of batteries, and now starting to have that decline in EVs, and all of the projections that experts in the field are making are projecting very significant declines in the coming years in the cost of those vehicles. And so I think it's very important that if we're talking about future adoption, that we project that not based upon current costs, but on projected costs as well. Those are really have to be aligned. And then I was very interested in the slide that showed that the visitors were essentially a third of our vehicle miles traveled and emissions, and you alluded to the significant portion and actually rapidly growing portion of those visitors that are essentially delivery vehicles, common carriers and otherwise. And we've seen that some of those companies have their own plans to electrify to varying degrees, but that's a rapidly growing portion of our vehicle trips as our retail patterns have changed. We're already changing before the pandemic and have been accelerated. And so it really begs the question of how we and other communities in the region may be able to drive electrification or conversion to zero emission vehicles, whether they're electrified or other methods of achieving zero emissions. How might we do that? And that's probably a regional collaboration if something were to happen. But I think it's an opportunity that has not been getting a lot of attention yet, even as that segment has been just going through the roof in terms of the proportion of the vehicles. And then those vehicles, I'd really be interested in, there may be studies on this, what percentage of the time are they idling, not going anywhere, whereas an electric vehicle is not going to have that idling issue. And so is the value of conversion of those fleets even higher in one sense than passenger fleets. So I'd also, we've talked about electrification, and that's certainly the primary conversion of our transportation. But hydrogen is in just the last year or two been re-emerging after decades of being out there as a concept and kind of going nowhere. But green hydrogen is now being taken very seriously. And in Europe especially is a major part of their projections, not entirely or even predominantly for vehicles, although that is a major segment. And probably more focused on fleets. So when we looked at our own fleet or these delivery fleets, it may be more of a future technology than for passenger vehicles, but that all remains to be seen. But I just want to make sure that we keep it on the drawing board. It's not hitting the commercialization at the rate that EVs are, and it may never be so, but it's certainly coming back into play. The Biden administration has made a huge investment and bet in development of green hydrogen, and I think we need to keep it within our planning range. Just a thought on the micromobility. Those were some interesting examples of electric cargo bikes. I'd encourage us to actually look at the full range of emerging technologies in micromobility. As it so happens, the Micromobility America conference is held annually, although it was virtual last year, but annually at Richmond Pavilion, and it's amazing the emergence of a whole range of vehicles that are evolving and coming to market. And these are a few examples, but it's much more broad than that. And I think we should really look at that. One of the things that we didn't touch on today, and it's beyond, and maybe we'll get a little more next week, but as we're going to these types of vehicles, our street infrastructure to make them safe and efficient transportation in our community is a major part of it. I will add that there was a mention of charging for micro-mobility vehicles, talking mostly about the electric bikes. There has been a number of companies that are starting to use light pole fixtures as charging stations in the US because we generally power those with 110 single phase power. They really aren't possibilities for car charging, whereas in Europe they're 208 power, and that's taking off. So we basically have electric distribution system throughout the community that can be tapped into for these charging of micro-mobility. And I saw recently that actually Los Angeles has been doing this, and even on the cars, and I don't quite follow how they were able to do that, but they've already adopted this approach, and there are now more companies than there were just an hour or two ago. Excuse me, a year or two ago. And so then I wanted to touch on the staffing component of the adoption of charging in the community. And so we've got our kind of, even in the nearer term, we've got a group of extremely capable and dedicated staff members who are focusing on this. But it seems that accelerating our program also needs to expand the staff that's available to work on that. And so could you comment on that aspect of what do we need? Because this committee is going to be making recommendations to the council, and we want to be forthright in terms of where our bottlenecks either are today or are on the horizon if we were to accelerate our progress so that we could actually meet our 80-30 goal.
I would just say that similarly to the conversation that we had last month, this is something that's a really active topic of internal discussion, and I don't think that we're ready. We have something specific to share with the committee quite yet.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Well, what I'd encourage you to do, even if you can't evaluate and come up with the totality of the solution, let's look at a known first phase of increasing that staffing to meet kind of the least needs that we have, and then with an understanding that looking at the final and more comprehensive response will take more time. So I'd really encourage that. But at this time, I'd be glad to hear from the public and then have our follow-up discussion.
Okay, well, thank you. And so we will take it out to the public now. So if participants who would like to make comments could raise your hands, we will call on you. Thank you.
Okay. So the first one is Arthur Keller, and then after that will Helen Grossman. So I will promote you to panelist, and you should be allowed to talk. Arthur Keller. Arthur Keller, are you able to?
Yes, thank you. When will Palo Alto have every parking space that is built be electric vehicle capable? Every electric vehicle capable?
Great.
Question. That's a question.
I think we're taking comments and we'll,
Okay, I'll continue. I currently, we are not requiring every parking space when we build them, but when we are not requiring any retrofit for existing spaces. So we have to provide them for when we build them, and when we retrofit them, we should be electric vehicle capable at least. Thank you.
thank you, Arthur Keller, for your comments. Well, next, Helen Grossman.
Hello, thank you so much for allowing me to speak. So I just wanted to ask a question. I think these programs are great. I'm really excited about all the contributions we're making to addressing pollution and climate change. And I wanted to ask what we are doing about small engines like gas leaf blowers and gardening equipment. So the California Air Resources Board has found that these types of small engines contribute more pollution to the air, more smog forming pollution than all passenger vehicles in California. And so I wanted to find out what we're doing to address some of that pollution. As you probably know, Mark Berman recently drove through a law, and he said we must look beyond transportation if we're to achieve the emissions reductions needed to fight climate change and improve air quality and health in our communities. And that law bans the sale of gas leaf blowers and similar gas-powered small engines in California. So I wanted to see what we're doing in Palo Alto to also address that source of pollution. I can say in my neighborhood, I see a lot of multi-million-dollar custom-built homes with multiple Teslas in their driveway, and their gardener is blowing around with a very loud, very polluting gas-powered leaf blower. And so it seems there's a lot we could do there and a pretty big ROI to reduce pollution in Palo Alto by incentivizing gardeners and helping gardeners switch over to cleaner electric equipment. So I wanted to find out what we're doing there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for your comment. Next is Evan, Lori, and after that will be Jay Rustin. Evan? Can you unmute yourself? Evan, are you there?
I am indeed here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So first of all, let me just extend my thanks to city staff. I do not envy your seats at the table at this point. This is a monumental lift, and you keep coming back to us with tremendous information that is actionable and urgent. And I can't begin to express my gratitude for the efforts that you're undertaking. At the very same time, I have to say that there is no way that we are going to get to where we need to be without working incredibly closely with surrounding government agencies. And I would like a lot more information about with whom we are planning to lobby to impose carbon taxes on delivery vehicles, how we're going to help move the needle both within barge and at a state level. I would also encourage staff to take a really close look at what is happening in Australia. They are far ahead of our curve. I don't think there are any models at the municipal level in the US that are too much further along than Palo Alto. And Europe has actually been leapfrogged by Australia. So I'd encourage a quick look there. Finally, I would say that I left this comment actually in the Q&A, but I'm not being facetious. I would love to see Denitra Ballman's garbage truck slide get out to all of the kindergartners in PAUSD. They would go gaga. I haven't had kindergartners in my house for a while, but I recognize a great image when I see one, and that was wonderful to get kids excited about changes that are coming for our transportation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next is Jay Roston, and after that, Jeffrey Hook. Jay Roston. Jay Roston, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So this message is mostly directed towards Hiromi, but for everybody. I put it in the Q&A also, and that is that I was so delighted to see some pictures from our past EV education classes that we gave at Mitchell Park Community Center. And that was in conjunction with Stanford. But I just wondered, because Forbes magazine clearly identified that EV education is one of the most important factors in promoting adoption. And even our survey showed that 40% of our attendees went on to get a car within 6 months. So I just wondered if anyone knows if there might be some more of those classes going on in the future, either online or in person.
Great, thank you for your comment, and we'll be answering that in the chat in the Q&A.
Beautiful.
Thank you very much. Next is Jeffrey Hook, and following that is Lawrence, and that's our last hand. If there's anyone else that wants to make a comment to our committee.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Hook, and I wanted to support the comments that Helene Grossman said. I applaud the lift for electrification of vehicles. This is an awesome project, and I really applaud the efforts. But there's a really low-hanging fruit here, and that is gas-powered garden equipment. At the last meeting a week ago, I think Jonathan Late said that enforcement of the gas blower ban was nearly impossible, but I don't think that's true. We send a code enforcement officer on a bicycle to tour the city and issue citations. It's super easy. And for every hour that we save of a gas-powered blower operating, that's worth, I think, 1,100 miles of a gasoline-powered car. So it's a huge return on investment. And it also has the benefit of reducing the noise and irritation of that these blowers cause in our city. So I urge you to find a way to send someone on a bicycle, get the code enforced, and this will make a huge stride in our moving toward climate sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And last is Lawrence.
Hi, Lawrence Garwin here. I'd like to give a shout out for the multifamily residents and renters assistance for getting chargers so people can charge at home. But as that's still in progress, it's super important that the city continues to put chargers around the neighborhoods where you're allowed to park overnight. A lot of them say 3 hours only. And it'd be nice if after a certain time at night you could park overnight, so you don't have to get up at 1 a.m. or such to bring your vehicle back. Also, I know that Sven Thiesen has done his sidewalk charging. I understand that was a big lift to work with the city on that. So to make permitting of sidewalk chargers much easier, I think would be a great benefit. And of course, as the city continues to think about how to put in sidewalk or parking space chargers around the city on city-owned land as well, that would be great. And as well, I really appreciate the fact that our air is much cleaner here than places like Panama City, because so many of our vehicles are newer and or electric, so that the air is cleaner to breathe. But I spend a lot of time in my yard. I spend a lot of time with the windows open, and just about every day of the week, sometimes multiple times a day, come under chemical attack from the gas leaf blowers, the lawnmowers, etc. So we already have a leaf blower ban in place, but there's an unwillingness of the city to enforce it. And people have made suggestions for public enforcement of it. And until the city can get somebody to actually do code enforcement for the city, I would think it would be great if a staff member was able to put together a way for people to submit evidence of violations via the web, via 311 app or whatever, and then tickets get sent automatically, warnings and tickets, without really any human intervention and without anyone having to go on scene, because the public is there saying, look, I don't like this. It's happening in my neighborhood. Here are the pictures. Here's the video with the audio. Please take care of it. So I know that the council's looking at getting another person to do code enforcement, but it might take months for that to happen. And perhaps a staff person can put something together very quickly to allow folks to send in evidence and tickets to be sent out without anyone having to go on scene from the city. So thank you very much for considering these things, and I applaud the city's efforts in moving forward to electrify transportation in and around the city.
Great, thank you, Lawrence. That is all of our speakers.
Okay, well, thanks to all the public speakers. I know we do want to take a break, but before we get to that, I want to give our ad hoc committee members a chance to make any further comments or follow up on any of what we've heard from the speakers.
Pat, you want to go first this time?
I'm good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I restricted myself to questions beforehand. So, you know, no surprise that we need to figure out, I want to double click on we do need a staffing plan to figure out how to implement this. So I know that you guys are working on it, and, you know, we're waiting for it. And that's crucial to us moving the needle on all of these. I think what I want to say in this area is that I hesitate to call this low-hanging fruit, but this is the biggest chunk of what we need to do. And it is, I think, less hard than forcing people to make changes inside their home. And it's most directly connected to, you know, ways that we have opportunities to utilize the fact that we have our own utilities. So, you know, I view this as the area we should really be focusing on and having a super concrete plan, that whether it's linear or there's a surge somewhere, that is super concrete. And I think we're getting close to that. And I think the council is going to have to make some directions and decisions that are different from what we've done so far. I wanted to just say how much I appreciated the photos on slide 31 of what it takes to do this installation. I really appreciate Ms. Kelty reminding us all that, you know, when it's done, it's like, great, you put in a charger, but what goes on behind that is really, it's real work, and it takes all of the parts on the iceberg to make it happen. Could we have slide 32 up again, please? Right. So C4, for example, that's the one we were talking about earlier, whether it's a study or whether it's our initial part, that absolutely has to happen. One thing I want to encourage us to do is focus on the ones that have more of the green leaves, right? The ones that really have the highest impact. I appreciate all the interest in e-bikes and e-scooters, and that absolutely needs to happen. And also, I think we need to stay focused on cars at the moment, because that's what most people are using. So it's a yes and, but we cannot do however many things are on here at the same time, 15 things at the same time. So I do want us to stay super focused on the cars and what it's going to take. It's interesting to contemplate whether it's people making the decision for environmental reasons, people concerned about, you know, the charging. Those are both things that we can focus on. Yeah. So I definitely wanted to just say that I think of all the things that we can do as a community, this is the one that if I had to choose one to start with, because I think we can make the most progress, this would be the one. The delivery truck thing is of interest. Really appreciate separating out people who live here from people who are coming here to work, from people who are coming to visit. It's not just delivery trucks though, right? It's going to be people who are coming to get care at Stanford Hospital or the VA. And so I'm glad that we're working with the partners on that. Not exactly sure what our next step should be here for the next iteration on this project. I'm guessing we have to wait for the staff, the resources needed to implement this. And that's probably work that Vice Mayor Burt and I need to do to think about what we want to recommend in terms of policy changes. Yeah, okay. So that's what I wanted to say sort of at a higher level about this topic.
Great, thanks. I guess first I'd like to touch on this kind of highest level focus of us looking at mobile sources versus buildings and stationary sources. I agree that dealing with the mobile sources has the least opposition and most receptivity in the community. But we also need to recognize what we're looking at on being able to accomplish in mobile sources is taking a trend that's already happening because of market forces and federal and state regulations and incentives, and trying to see what we can do locally to make sure that it's accelerating at as fast of a pace as we can. Whereas on stationary sources like building electrification, that's overwhelmingly based upon our local incentives and initiatives, and to whatever extent we may have eventual mandates. And so we need to look at each of those that way, that the degree to which we can move the dial amongst those two biggest buckets is actually probably greater on the stationary sources, but with greater potential resistance at the same time. And I did want to bring up that I'd like us to be looking at other real cutting edge models. I'm sure our staff is already doing that, but I know that SMUD is doing some really phenomenal things. That's the Sacramento Utility District. They're probably, from my understanding in the state, maybe the leaders on that. I also wanted to get a follow-up in the future on this big issue of the need to upgrade transformers. And, you know, that's our infrastructure upstream from the charging meters. And I think it's been as we're moving toward broad electrification of transportation and buildings, this is a big issue that has not really had much discussion and attention yet, and that I want to make sure that we have a plan that keeps pace with what we're trying to accelerate in the mobile and stationary source electrification. And then I did want to follow up on the issue of small motors and where do we put the various gardening and other small motors and engines in our whole matrix. I think that they probably properly belong in this category, and this category should be mobile or non-stationary sources. That might be the best way to put them, but they need to be somewhere. And has staff done any evaluation on both the amount of our emissions that is coming from those sources and the cost effectiveness of addressing those emissions, even if they're not our largest source?
To my knowledge, we have not done that kind of analysis yet. I'll let anyone else jump in if they'd like to.
Yes, I'll jump in. So within the category of transportation and mobile sources. The gardening equipment is included in that, and it's a very, very small percentage of the overall transportation and mobile sources. It's included in what's called the off-road equipment category, which I have to go back and look at the numbers, but was I think it was less than 4% of the overall transportation and mobile sources. That mostly because while the gas-powered gardening equipment emits a huge amount of pollution, it actually emits a very, very small amount of carbon dioxide equivalent, so greenhouse gases. So it's a horrible for pollution, worse pollutant than a car, but the amount of emissions are relatively small, and that's reflected in our overall greenhouse gas emissions inventory.
And then the other part of that, as we look at all of our programs, is the cost effectiveness of our initiatives. And so I'd like to see that, even though the percentage of our GHG emissions from those sources is small, do we get a very high bang for the buck on programs to reduce those? Because, you know, those, when we adopted our so-called ban on gas-powered leaf blowers, we didn't have the battery technologies for that whole range of equipment that exists today. I'm actually encouraged that I'm seeing, without a mandate, starting to see commercial gardeners adopt it. It's still a minority, but it's catching on just because it's cost effective, it's safer and healthier for the gardeners as well, and they're starting to come on board, whereas 15 years ago they were part of the resistance. They're starting to actually advocate for this adoption. And I think we could, when we look at subsidy programs, we could get a lot of benefit for a relatively low cost. One thing I want to follow up on the multifamily initiative, when we are doing our support programs, what, out of all those dollars that are going into supporting that, what portion of the total cost of multifamily chargers is being provided by us versus the multifamily property owners?
I'll take a first stab at that. We pay up to 75% of the total cost. And so what we've seen so far is that the majority of projects will not be covered 100% by our rebates. And they definitely do have to put some money into the project to make it happen.
Okay, thank you. And then lastly, one of the challenges that Romy, you pointed out with that graph showing the age of vehicles among Palo Alto, I think it's Palo Alto residents. Will we and the state will have a challenge on how do we move those last that last half or third of vehicle owners who are less inclined to transition? And for many of those owners, it's because they're lower income, and at this point in time, they can't afford the premium on electric vehicles, but that premium is disappearing rapidly in just the next few years. But even then, they don't have the resources to transition to a new vehicle, even if the cost of ownership is lower. And I think that this is something that we may have a marginal role on. Some of the speakers had talked about the need to collaborate and advocate, because I think essentially state incentives are going to be critical in this. We've had cash for clunker programs for decades that were very important on removing from the road our worst polluters. And we don't yet really have something like that here. Senator Becker was pushing this legislative season. I don't think it went through a a waiver of sales tax on used EVs, which would be really more likely the candidate purchase for lower income folks. And that legislation unfortunately provided that incentive for everyone. And I'm a little worried that making used EVs cheaper for everyone means that folks like us might go out and have a better incentive to buy a used EV for our local trips, driving up the value in the market of used EVs and making them less affordable for low income people. So I think it really needs to be targeted on low income people. One thing that we may want to be looking at in the city is a far less costly subsidy toward electric micromobility for low income people, whether that is electric bikes or other things. And so that's something that might be within our budgetary range and have an impact and have a benefit to those residents. So thanks again for a really good presentation, and to the public for these comments. I guess after our break, we're going to talk about the something equivalent to the Palo Alto Green program. Is that correct, Brad?
Yes, that's right.
Can I just follow up on one thing before we go to our break? Great, thanks. So I'm thinking about what I said about how I feel like this is I agree this has the lowest resistance in terms of it, but thinking about the gas-powered leaf blowers, I wonder if really what we're trying to do is get the gas out. We should be, and also connecting this to a suggestion we had last time, which was to target people who have electric vehicles already as early adopters of getting the gas out of their home, right? Converting their appliances. I wonder if we, in this instance, should be thinking about getting the gas out of your car, home, and yard, right? As a way to communicate rather than doing it. I know why we're doing it in our separate silos, as it were. It's understandable, but that's not how it feels to the person who lives in their home or apartment or condominium. So maybe there is a way for us to integrate all of these and help people understand all of the areas they have an opportunity to make a difference. So just a thought about integrating our messaging.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and take our break. It's 10:48. Why don't we resume at 10:55? So see you all then. I think we're ready to get started again. So Jonathan will review some slides on Palo Alto Green.
Good morning, subcommittee members. Jonathan Abendschein, Assistant Director in the Utilities Department. There has been some discussion in our past meetings about, certainly about funding sources, and then and some interest about Palo Alto Green, which was a historical green electricity program that we had and a green gas program. And whether that program concept could be relevant to funding for the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan today. So I just have a few slides. I wanted to provide a little bit of background to inform the subcommittee's discussion. And I think we're interested in feedback from the subcommittee on what direction and what priority you are looking for in consideration of this program. So a little bit of history. The Palo Alto Green program started with the Palo Alto Green Electric program, which started in 2003. In 2013, the residential, so this was a voluntary program where somebody would sign up, they would pay a 1.5 cent per kilowatt hour premium, which was in the ballpark of a 10% increase in rates back then. And they would get 100% renewable electricity. It was a purchase of renewable energy credits rather than what we do today, which is to enter into long-term contracts for new renewable sources. It was later replaced with the carbon neutral electricity program. And when that happened in 2013, the residential program was ended. But the commercial program continues because there are a few large customers, including the city, who use the participation in Palo Alto Green to meet their LEED compliance requirements. That's the LEED Green Building Standard. Palo Alto Green Gas was a short-lived successor to the Palo Alto Green Electric program. It started in 2014. It was different in the sense that it was not purchasing, and didn't involve purchasing green gas. Instead, it involved purchasing offsets to offset the greenhouse gas emissions associated with a resident's gas consumption. That started in 2014, but it ended pretty quickly in 2017 when we adopted the carbon neutral gas program. And we are now buying offsets to mitigate the carbon impact of all Palo Alto natural gas use. Next slide, please. So at the height of when the program was at its most active was 2011 and 2012, just before the residential program ended. At that point, revenues were roughly a little bit over $1 million per year. And that was offset by an administration cost of about $400,000 per year. And that involved, at times, we used consultants to market and manage compliance for the program. We also, at times, did that work in-house using in-house city staff. There was also a workload associated with marketing the program, including a workload that involved our customer service representatives who were responsible for signing up a lot of residents. In 2011 and 2012, this $1 million per year, so that was about a net benefit of about $700,000 per year, all of which went towards buying renewable electricity. About 50% of the revenue that you're seeing there came from residents. About a quarter came from city accounts, and about a quarter came from residential accounts. And those were anchored by a few large commercial facilities. And again, that was to meet their sustainability goals or to meet LEED building certification requirements. About 20% of residents were participating by the time the program closed. And that's a very high percentage of residential population. But they still only accounted for 50% of the revenue because we have large commercial facilities in our city, and getting participation from a few of those can easily rival a significant percentage of the residential population. So a lot of the revenues for this program was coming from the commercial and city accounts. Let's see. And I would say that the commercial accounts, we probably had participation from accounted. I don't know how many accounts it was, but it accounted for about 5% of the non-residential kilowatt hours sold. Next slide, please. So I think we've done a little bit of brainstorming around Palo Alto Green because it was a really successful brand and something I think we've thought could be valuable in one way or another in the future. But I think we've struggled with exactly what form a Palo Alto Green program would take. I think some of the concepts that have come up as Palo Alto Green voluntary program to fund electrification. I think the challenge there is understanding exactly what value proposition would be for the people who participate. Unlike renewable energy, where it is very difficult for an individual to go out and buy renewable energy on their own, in some ways you're almost creating a middle layer by having someone sign up for a program and then providing them funds or incentives or services in order to help them electrify. These funds could in some ways be simply spent directly by the person themselves to electrify their own home. We've also thought about a voluntary program for carbon removal or offsets, similar to what we've done for gas. That could be used to as either an interim measure or to focus on scope 3 emissions, the indirect emissions associated with consumption of goods and services. Also, Palo Alto Green as a recognition program to recognize residents who take steps towards electrifying. So those are some of the ideas that we've kicked around. We do have a lot of funding sources that are available right now to fund early stage electrification programs. And there is a significant administrative overhead associated with ramping up the Palo Alto Green program. I will just remind people that the program did not generate significant, it didn't generate the levels of revenue that you're talking, that I showed in the previous slide until it had been in place for roughly 8 years. And it took a while to ramp up participation there. So I guess our questions, we put some questions out to hopefully frame the discussions. I think what we're hoping for feedback on is, number one, what would be the goals of a new Palo Alto Green program? And where are we seeing funding from Palo Alto Green most needed? What's the value proposition to the resident? And then I think also there's the timing of the funding. When do we expect the funding is going to be needed? And when the funding arrives, will it be at the scale necessary to meet the funding needs that are in place several years from now? So looking forward to the discussion, happy to answer any questions that I can, and interested to hear what the feedback from the subcommittee.
Great. I'd be glad to go first on this one. So first, I just want to make sure we're framing this as this was actually included in the council motion on the direction for creation of this committee and areas that we want to pursue or explore. It was not something that was determined the outcome, but it was actually council direction to explore this. John, when we had that, I guess you said it was 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour was the the premium rate?
One and a half.
Yeah. So ballpark about a 15% premium on electricity bills. Is that?
Back then it was about 10%. It would be a little bit now.
Okay. So one of the things we don't know is how much support there would be for a program like this by both residents and commercial customers. I suspect, but don't know for sure, that since Palo Alto Green was adopted over what was the inception date? 2000 over.
I'm sorry, it was 2003.
2003, so almost 20 years ago. The level of concern and commitment within the community among residents and businesses, in all likelihood, has gone up significantly in our concern about climate change. So we had a 20% adoption, willing to pay a 10% premium on electricity back almost 20 years ago. And I think, but don't know until we poll and survey on this, that we would have a much stronger commitment today than we did then. And so we have to figure out how we get the answer to that question, what the percentage of support and participation might be, and how high of a premium they'd be willing to voluntarily pay for a series of climate programs. And that goes into your other question of, what would be the uses? That needs to be flushed out more, but I think it's really about gaps in achieving our outcomes and not principally about the ratepayer receiving the benefit themselves. This is a willingness of, just like it was previously, the ratepayer, when we had Palo Alto Green, wasn't receiving some special benefit for that premium. They were contributing to the community need, and that was the driver, not the return that they would get. And I'm not assuming that that would change if we adopted a new program along those lines. And I think that certainly among the more appealing uses would be, how do we help those in our community who are less able financially to be able to do a number of the initiatives that we know are beneficial, whether it's subsidies for heat pumps in low income households, whether it's electrification of vehicles or other measures. Those would be things that I would be very interested in finding out through polling. I don't think we can fit it in with our upcoming business tax polling because that's pretty tapped out on questions. We might have an ability with doing a sampling polling amongst prior participants in our Palo Alto Green program to ask them in a survey what their receptivity would be to participating in a new program with whatever range of uses we would lay out, or allow them to respond to what uses they think would be most receptive to them and make them most inclined to participate. So those are thoughts I have on this. We certainly don't have the answers yet on whether this is the right thing to do or a right thing to do, because as you said, it wouldn't be able to address anywhere near the totality of our needs for climate programs. But I think we have a strong corporate and resident inclination and willingness to do more, and to do so for many folks voluntarily. And it really allows those who are anxious, willing, and able to do more, to have this additional vehicle And it doesn't run up against mandatory programs and those that are less inclined to support them. Like I said, it's not anywhere near the totality of our solution, but I'm going to be very interested in what the community response would be to a program like this to really kickstart some of what we can't yet do. Thanks.
Brad, I'd like to hear from the public before I weigh in.
Absolutely. And I see that we've got at least one raised hand. So if anyone else would like, everyone who wants to speak on this topic, please raise your hand and we'll get to you.
The first hand is Bob Winslow. So Bob, I promoted you to panelist and now you can make your comments.
There we go.
Great, thanks, Bob.
I'm doing this on an iPhone, so new buttons to push. I didn't expect to speak on this topic, but I wanted to just share, at first level, my support for using this as yet again another channel of engagement, both the community and business. And I wanted to build out one area that I'd been talking with some friends about, which relates to offsets, or broadly the term of drawdown, and a situation or challenge we ran into with working with the utility department on the Oaxaca offset model. And in broader context, maybe the tool I yield in this sustainability discussion is the belief of drawdown as a parallel component to transforming our community. The challenge we ran into that I think this has an interesting way of addressing was, as we created the contract for the carbon offsets in Oaxaca, at one point we aspired to have Palo Alto utilities have a role in the development of offset projects. And offsets projects, I'll try and be brief, but offset projects have an investment component. Say one of these 20,000 hectare community projects might take $25,000 to $30,000 to develop the project, which then allows them to enter the Climate Action Reserve to have a protocol to basically sell verified carbon offsets that then Palo Alto can use as a drawdown component. The contract with Palo Alto basically required a guarantee on any investment Palo Alto utilities would make, which essentially ultimately meant that someone else needed to put up the $30,000 per project, because otherwise it's not guaranteed. So the broader concept is that Palo Alto Green could be a vehicle to provide capitalization of offset capacity that would basically be able to be used as a guarantor of developing offset capacity, which then would allow Palo Alto utilities then to go into purchase contracts of verified offsets, rather than being involved in the at-risk component of developing the projects. So I think there's a need for what you might call at-risk monies, and this is just a neat tool or approach. So thanks for letting me be slightly long-winded and supporting the concept. That's all.
Great, thanks, Bob. I don't see any hands raised, so Councilmember Cormack.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ms. North. Okay, a few thoughts. First of all, really appreciate the background information. 20% participation is great. 36% on admin is high. Was probably necessary, but it does seem like that was, an expensive way to generate that revenue. One thing that's different between then and now, I think a lot, I didn't hear this described, but one of the objectives, it seemed at the time, was to build awareness in the community about how our electricity was changing, and could change and should change. And I think that something that's different now is we have social media, right? Even just the penetration of the modes for people to communicate with each other was nowhere near in 2012, where we are today. So I don't know how much of that would be awareness. It's possible. It could provide some as a channel. Appreciate the interest in whether we do polling or ask prior participants. Those are helpful data points. It's interesting to think about a way to capitalize anxiety, give people something to do with their anxiety, which is pull out their wallet. I guess I would really be thinking about, I know the utilities program actually has an alternate method for doing what is essentially a donation for others, as opposed to a way to get a benefit for oneself. And that seems to have been really successful. Could staff talk about that briefly? I know there's a program for people to donate for others who are having trouble paying their utility bills, and it seemed like we got a significant amount of donations during the pandemic. Thoughts on that as a way to channel interest?
I would really welcome somebody who can speak to these numbers a little bit more precisely. I believe before the pandemic, we received about $20,000 in donations every year from that program. And I think in the pandemic that increased pretty significantly, but I think it was still under about $100,000 per year.
So
but let me check on that number and get back to you.
That's fine. That's helpful. Ballpark is helpful. This could be an acceleration fund, meaning we could do some of this work more quickly. This could be a community fund, meaning this is a way for you, if you're able to help someone else either purchase an electric vehicle, install a charger, or replace their gas water heater. I guess I'm thinking about this more from a philanthropic standpoint than from a benefit standpoint. So for me, what the goal of any program we do in this area would be to give an opportunity to those in our community who have sufficient resources to contribute to those who have financial challenges, either switching their vehicle or something in their home. So that if I had to boil it down, that's what I'm really looking at. It does seem like, I'm not going to say it's a relatively small amount per year in comparison to the others. Hard to imagine doing more than a 10% delta to rates. But I think some way for people in the community to help others is definitely in order, and will help the people who are ready and willing to provide either their time or their resources to help others. I guess that's another way to think about it. Is this more than just funding? Is this a way for people who have already done this and want to help others to provide either time and or resources to the next tranche as we try to cross the chasm here? So those are my overall thoughts on this. But I think we should be clear on whether we're trying to accelerate something or whether we're trying to help others participate in the change. So those are my thoughts on this one.
Thank
Sorry,
you, Councilmember. This is very helpful.
Yeah, I was going to say, just as a follow-up, I don't think we, I think we have some ideas about how we might use it, and supporting low-income needs is certainly one that is high on my list, but I don't go in, excuse me, I don't go into this process assuming that I necessarily know or we know what would be the best uses and the uses that the community and the voluntary participants would find as highest value. So I certainly concur that supporting low-income programs would be high on my list of things I'd want to explore. Bob Winslow had another suggestion, and then we have certain unmet needs that might be important in our climate action programs where we don't currently have funding sources. So I think it needs a deeper exploration, and then to bounce that off the public and see what their response is.
Okay, well, thank you for the discussion on this topic. And I believe that takes us to the end of today's agenda, other than pointing out our next meeting, as we touched on earlier, December 9th, where we'll be talking about mobility programs and land use and how it affects emissions. So with that, before we close, are there any parting thoughts from Councilmember Cormack or Vice Mayor Burt?
I think everyone, just about everybody on this call needs to drink some more tea and invest in cough drops. It's definitely that time of year. I think just the one thing I wanted to add is that, for members of the public listening, we're hoping to be able to incorporate our working group quite soon. And we look forward to that as another way for people to participate. We're also thinking about the best ways we can continue to stay engaged with our youth community, who has obviously a lot of interest in this and will be greatly affected by what we do or don't do. So I just wanted to share that from a process standpoint. And then I just wanted to take a moment to say, again, today I wasn't able to follow all the questions and answers because they were even faster than last time. But I just want to emphasize that this format, I think, is proving meaningful for all the participants. And I want to thank staff who's working furiously in the background. I think this is really a great new model for how we can, work on hard topics together.
Agreed.
Okay, well, with that, let's close out the meeting. Thanks to everyone who attended, and we hope to see you in December.
Thanks.